You certainly would have to classify the Minnesota Vikings as a surprise team in 2012. This was a team that you thought was going to be in full rebuild mode potentially for a couple of years, and was definitely not going to be any type of force to be reckoned with in the NFC, or at least even in the NFC North. But they started off the year very strong. At one point in time, they were still 6-4, even though they scuffled a little bit in the middle of the season, and things were looking up. But you kind of waited for the rug to be pulled out from under them and for the Vikings to come crashing back down to reality. Then they lost two straight games. We're sitting at 6-6, and it looked like reality had finally caught up with the Minnesota Vikings. But they surprised us, had one last run in them. They won their last four games and ended up finishing 10-6, second in the NFC North, and made the playoffs, where they lost in the wild card round to the Green Bay Packers. Christian Ponder obviously being hurt was a significant factor in that game. Would they have won with Christian Ponder? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. But you have to be excited if you're a Vikings fan that this team went from winning, 3 games in 2011 to winning 10 in 2012 and making an appearance in the playoffs. That does bode at least somewhat well for the future. Why did they end up making the playoffs? It's very simple. No offense to Peyton Manning, who had a great year. No offense to other guys that had great years. But clearly, to me, the MVP of the NFL in 2012 has to be Adrian Peterson. 2,095 rushing yards. 2,095. He almost got to what has seemed like for many years an unreachable record, and that's Eric Dickerson's single-season rushing total. AP put this team on his back late in the year and said, I'm going to get us to the playoffs, hell or high water. And he did. That's why he deserves to be the 2012 NFL Most Valuable Player. When you look at the quarterback position, second-year quarterback Christian Ponder had very good games, like the game against San Francisco earlier in the year, where, quite frankly, Minnesota beat the piss out of the 49ers. That was a surprising game, and maybe Ponder's best pure performance of the season. But he also had other games where he was just god-awful terrible. I think about that first game against Green Bay at Lambeau Field. He was terrible. He had some other terrible games, too. Inconsistent is one way to describe Christian Ponder, no question. This team was hurt a little bit with the loss of Percy Harvin during the season. He already knew that they lacked some weapons in the passing game. He pretty much had Harvin and Kyle Rudolph and then a bunch of pretenders. But once they lost Percy Harvin, Ponder really didn't have much to throw to in the passing game other than, frankly, Kyle Rudolph. It really exposed the lack of talent and depth at the wide receiver position on that offense. They finished second in the league in rushing yards and 31st in the league in passing yards. So obviously, one aspect of the offense was very good and the other was very boo-boo. You look at them defensively. This is a defense that added some youth, particularly in their secondary, and played a little bit better in 2012. Jared Allen had another great season, double-digit sacks. Their linebacking core was okay, but definitely nothing great or special like they have been for many seasons. I think the secondary at times flashed some improvements and other times still showed that they were young and, frankly, not the most talented unit in the league. Harrison Smith came in as a first-round pick, and the way I put him is when he's playing center field, he's great. In run support, he's very good. When he has to play over the top in a 2 or 3 deep zone and he's asked to play left field or right field, he's boo-boo. Their corners like Josh Robinson, they have talent, but they have a long ways to go. They have a lot more developing to do. And that was reflective in their 24th against the past ranking in 2012. The Vikings defense still has some improvement, even though this was a team, like I said, that ended up winning their last 4 games to go 10-6, and they made it to the playoffs. As far as the Vikings draft history over the past few years, the jury's kind of still out a little bit on a couple of these classes. Now, I'll say in 2008, they got an absolute stud at center in John Sullivan, who I think they took in the 6th round, if I remember right, but the rest of that draft class was pretty much a waste. You look at 2009, that draft class was one major reason that the Vikings were arguably the best team in the NFL in 2009, the most balanced and complete football team offensively and defensively, with guys like Percy Harvin and Phil Loadholt coming in and having immediate contributions, and in Harvin's case, big contributions as a rookie. 2010, they found guys like Chris Cook, who needs to stop being his own worst enemy and stop getting in trouble. Toby Gerhart, who provides some depth, obviously, in the running game in the backfield behind AP. And Everson Griffin was a great value pick in the fourth round, the defensive end from USC. And you saw that in this past season. 2011, the jury's ultimately still going to be out. You got guys like Carl Rudolph and Brandon Fusco, who were starters on that team this year. But ultimately, that draft success is going to hinge solely, primarily, on the development and success and or failure of Christian Ponder. I think over the past 5 drafts, 2012 was by far their best one. Matt Khalil had a very good year in pass protection as a rookie, protecting Christian Ponder's blind side, even though at moments I think he wasn't quite as good as people tried to advertise him to be. He struggled mightily, I felt at times, in the running game, but there were plenty of flashes of greatness there, and I would assume he'll only get better. Harrison Smith was a great pick at the end of the first round. They made the right decision trading up to get him. You have other guys too, like Robinson and Wright and Rhett Ellison and Blair Walsh, who was an all-pro kicker as a rookie. This was a really good draft class, and these are the type of draft classes when you're trying to rebuild that when you take these guys and they come in and they contribute immediately and look like they're going to be contributors for a long time, that puts you that much closer to no longer being in rebuilding mode and being in ready to win now mode. Now, as we head into this offseason, into the 2013 NFL Draft, one interesting subplot is going to be what's going to happen with Percy Harvin. Are the Vikings going to be forced to trade him, or are they going to be able to work things out with him and keep him there long term? That will be interesting to see. Now, in terms of what their actual philosophy in the draft would be at this point, I think whether Harvin's there or not, regardless, wide receiver is arguably the biggest need on that team on either side of the ball. And if they get rid of Harvin in particular, it just jumps up the board in terms of priorities. They need help at that position beyond question. They could perhaps use a little help on the interior of that offensive line too, but I think that's more of something you could potentially address in the middle rounds. Defensively, you could potentially see this team looking very strongly at taking a linebacker in the first round, and you also could be looking at them trying to take a defensive tackle in the first round. Having somebody that they could put next to Kevin Williams, and then eventually as Kevin Williams, fades off into the distance, replace Kevin Williams and be the new anchor of that defense in the middle of that defensive line. So the potential possibility in terms of picks for the Vikings in this first round, are varied. You could look at wide receivers like a Keenan Allen if he drops, if a Cordero Patterson somehow, some way is still there, DeAndre Hopkins, maybe a Terrence Williams from Baylor. Maybe they like a Tavon Austin, get a different Percy Harvin. They could be looking, like I said, at defensive tackle guys like Jonathan Hankins, Jesse Williams, Sharif Floyd, Kawan Short. They could be looking at linebackers like Alec Ogletree or Monte Teo, corners even. As much as they've tried to address the secondary still could use some upgrading. Guys like Desmond Trufant or Xavier Rhodes from Florida State could be possibly up for consideration. The Vikings have a lot of options in terms of where they can go. I think it's more important necessarily than addressing pure needs for them to just make sure that they draft guys that contribute right away and have the ability to contribute long term. I would expect in the first couple of rounds for them to address wide receiver at least once, linebacker once, and either the interior of the offensive line and or the interior of the defensive line at least one time. That would probably be how I would expect the board to play out, but if the Vikings just sat there and said, we get our pick at 23, we'll just take the best player available, period, regardless, it's hard to knock that philosophy as well. But I do think they need to curtail that just a little bit and focus on best player available at certain positions of need and draft accordingly.